How many times in a movie or a novel or a TV show or an audio drama does a plot beat hinge on the main characters being unable to complete a task or advance to the next scene because they are waiting on someone else? And how often do you see that used successfully in video games? Because putting characters, and especially player characters, into a situation where they must wait can be awkward. We saw this when Alan was trapped in a cabin during the dream sequence of the tutorial. We also saw this if we don't move to the correct locations on the ferry to trigger different parts of the dialogue. As Alan Wake arrives at the Oh Dear Diner in the early moments of Episode 1, we see how creating atmosphere and just a little bit of empty space, even a touch of boredom, can drive player engagement if it's done well. This scene opens with Alice dropping Alan off outside of the diner, saying that she's going to get gas while he collects the key to their rented cabin from a man named Stucky. Alan enters the diner and is immediately hit with yet another reminder that he will not be anonymous in Bright Falls, even though he has traveled all the way across the country to escape from his troubles. The scene leans into small-town Americana tropes as Alan comments on how
I'd forgotten there were still places like this. Towns where everybody knew everybody.
There's a bit of irony here in that Alan came to Bright Falls hoping to disappear for a while. And instead, he has come to a place where not only do the locals know one another, but his own celebrity status is even more on display here than if he had, say, taken a week-long staycation in the anonymous, busy city of New York. And that does bring us to Rose. Rose, the waitress at the Oh Dear Diner. Rose, who has read every one of Alan Wake's books and keeps a cardboard cutout standee of him in the diner. Alan's frustration is immediately apparent as Rose recognizes him and begins babbling about her love for his books. She is enthusiastic, overly friendly, and generally a bit much. But she's also charming, and she enthusiastically welcomes Alan and informs him that Stucky has just stepped into the bathroom, so if he waits, he will get his cabin key soon. Unable to complete Alan's quest immediately, the player has to wait for Stucky to emerge from the bathroom, which he will never do. Or we have to engage with the scene until we feel the same degree of impatience that Alan does. We can wander around and listen to Rose as she enthuses about Alan's work and offers to show him a good time while he's in town if his wife isn't with him. We can talk to Rusty or the Anderson brothers. We can study the Deerfest banners. We can look at the small-town advertisements stuck to the corkboard or stare in awkward frustration at that cardboard cutout of Alan right by the diner door. There's an alignment here of the player feeling stuck and the character feeling stuck that resolves in a natural, if very specific manner. Alan is a bit more brusque to Rose than he was to Pat back on the ferry, especially when she offers to give him a private tour of the town. But he still maintains a professional, mostly kind demeanor. Before we get to the interactive elements available during this awkward wait, there's one more subtle element which stands out to me. It's brief, no more than a couple of seconds, but one of those choices that the designers made which foreshadows the importance of a character before they have been fully introduced. Just as Rose finishes explaining about the absence of Stucky, the view cuts to the perspective of the lamp lady, who is standing at the rear of the diner, right near the dark hallway that leads to the bathroom. This cut stands out to me because, as with movies, video games like Alan Wake are expensive to produce. We're not talking about one person sitting down and tapping away at a keyboard or rambling into a microphone. We're talking dozens of designers working on building each scene and having meetings about where to place the perspective camera during the cutscenes. Why would we draw the audience's attention to this woman's perspective, especially in such an awkwardly brief manner? It is a great moment of foreshadowing Cynthia Weaver's importance, even if it's so brief that, like the shifts in perspective in the dream sequence, it honestly almost feels like a glitch. If this shot had been allowed to linger a moment longer, or if Remedy had animated the lamp lady to be looking back and forth between Alan and the dark hallway, then this would have been a perfect moment. Instead, it feels a little awkward, but it is important foreshadowing. We gain control of Alan again, standing at the counter by Rose and Rusty the Ranger, who is enjoying a cup of coffee and the local newspaper. Pages of the manuscript that we find later in the game will eventually reveal that Rusty has an unrequited crush on Rose. But for now, the scene mostly leans into Rusty's presence as a man in uniform, kind of half keeping an eye on the two old men in the corner booth. That. And there's a joke which Rose makes.
Try the coffee. Just don't blame me when you fall in love, because it'll break your heart when you have to leave.
Rusty here is no longer human. Nothing but black coffee under a thin layer of skin.
Yeah, that makes two of us.
It's a casual statement that we normally wouldn't think that much about. It's even a little on the nose as far as foreshadowing goes, evoking memories of Alan's nightmare to hint at a dark fate for Rusty. In Alan's dream, we burned away a layer of darkness to reveal the fragile, corrupted humanity of what lies beneath. Now, that metaphor has been inverted to describe Rusty. The story has taken a seemingly kindly man in uniform of a park ranger and, without making any direct threats against him, brought to mind the fear that we, as Alan, so recently experienced. As we explore the diner, still waiting for Stucky to emerge from the bathroom, players must walk near a booth occupied by two old men, right beside a battered old jukebox. Rusty will later explain that they are the Anderson brothers, residents of a local psychiatric hospital at Cauldron Lake Lodge. The one with the eye patch, who we'll eventually learn is named Odin, calls out to Alan as we approach, insisting that we start up a song on the jukebox. As with our interaction with Alice, we could ignore him. And nothing changes about the scene, except that we don't get to listen to some music. But if we guide Alan over to the jukebox, an interaction prompt will appear on screen, telling us to hit the jukebox. And this introduces a new mechanic. Repeatedly tapping the interaction button at a specific speed can make an effect occur. Compared to the spoon-fed instructions in the dream sequence, this is a brilliant moment of combining gameplay tutorials and characterization. It allows us to see Alan as willing to set aside his irritability to humor the Anderson brothers by giving us the option of participating in this tutorial or skipping it. If we participate, we are rewarded with the ironically light-hearted tune of The Coconut Song by Harry Nilsson, which also may hint at the bad advice being given out by the head doctor at Cauldron Lake Lodge. We can take as much time as we like to study the advertisements for the Coffee World Amusement Park, for Deerfest, for local beer brands, and other quirky small town announcements. We can stand beside the jukebox and listen to the entirety of the Coconut Song as Odin slaps his hands on the tabletop in time with the music, and his brother Thor grinds his teeth and spits frustrated insults. In contrast with clearly choreographed moments on the ferry, this scene in the Oh Dear Diner thoughtfully melds player agency and character-driven story. If we linger, Alan seems more patient and learns more about the town, but will eventually have to follow the narrative which has been laid out for him. If we ignore all of these interactive elements and press on to the next moment of the story, we confirm Alan's previous characterization as impatient and snarky. There aren't any directly gamified role-playing moments, but the ability to rush or linger and feel as though both options are validated by the narrative stands out as one of the better moments in the opening episode of Alan Wake. No matter how long we wait, Stucky never emerges from the bathroom. Rose and Rusty don't really have much more to say to Alan. The jukebox keeps on playing, and the brothers continue bickering. Eventually, both the player and Alan will grow frustrated at waiting and choose to walk into the dark hallway at the back of the diner, where Stucky is supposedly taking an eternity in the bathroom. As players, the only way we can advance the plot is to participate in Alan's impatience and step into the darkness and knock on the bathroom door. I feel this is a more subtle form of the narrative forcing a particular path on us than when the camera is repeatedly pulled away from us during the nightmare sequence. More subtle even than the developers using press-to-view prompts for the optional monologues from the hitchhiker, or the story-driven contextual prompts that indicate what will happen if we press on an interaction key while standing beside the car on the ferry or standing at the jukebox. It's closer to Alice inviting us to participate in the story. But no invitation is given. It's up to us as the player to decide how Alan will behave in this moment. Here in the Oh Dear Diner, even the most patient player will likely become bored and frustrated after waiting for several minutes and listening to the entirety of the Coconut Song. Alan and the player both choose to ignore the lamp lady's warning and press back into the darkness of the hall, rather than continuing to be patient. Without even being prompted, players put themselves into the role of Alan and participate actively in his impatience in order for the plot to advance. That is one of the powers of video games compared to film or audio or text. We're not hurried into a situation by a cutscene. We haven't merely turned a page in a novel. We have more agency than that which is ever afforded by the ever-progressing clock of a progress bar. But we don't have enough agency to change the story. Yet. The only option is to knock, And this triggers a cutscene in which Alan repeatedly knocks and calls out, but receives no response from Stucky. Instead, a voice speaks to us from the darkness, a voice that Alan doesn't recognize, but we as players might. In this brief cutscene, Alan looks back down the dark hallway he just passed through and sees a woman dressed in funeral garb, who has seemingly appeared out of thin air. Characters mysteriously appearing and disappearing is a trope in so many forms of literature, but remember that everything has been so natural since Alan woke up. We've encountered a series of quirky locals, to be sure, but everything followed on in a very realistic manner, until the appearance of the woman in black. And note her choice of words.
Carl couldn't make it. Unfortunately, he was taken ill.
It's subtle. But using the word taken here, instead of saying that he became sick or is feeling bad or that he's gone home to sleep off a stomach bug, it is a colloquialism, but it is also a very specific dialogue choice intended to evoke what the voice from the light told us about those taken by the darkness. The specific choices continue in a sequence of brief cuts and canted, tightly framed camera angles as the woman in black holds out an old-fashioned skeleton key and an envelope, dangling both from the fingertips of a single hand. She says that she will come by later to meet Alan's wife at her cabin on the lake. Her cabin, not Carl Stucky's cabin. And Alan takes the key and the directions without question. While this could be explained as a husband who didn't make the vacation arrangements, blithely accepting whatever the quirky locals hand to him, there is an element of the uncanny to both his vaguely irritated expression and the woman's creaking whispers. And then we're given control of Alan again. And the woman is there in the dimly lit hallway with us. Remember, she was not behind us before, nor was she out in the diner. And the door at the end of the hallway is still locked and was before if you had gone over and checked it. It's almost as if we summoned her by knocking on the bathroom door here in the darkness. Walking past her, on our way back to the main room of the diner, the woman in black tells us that Cauldron Lake is a very special place. There's nothing evil or inherently scary in those words, but something in the cadence and tone of the delivery lingers and makes the player perhaps wonder why she doesn't follow us down the hallway and into the light. Remember that liminal spaces have been significant before, especially in Alan's nightmare. Dream logic, shadows and light, passing through tunnels and doorways and over bridges have all been essential to triggering events or blocking our return to previous sequences. Even upon waking, we found Alan on a ferry, trapped in this middle place. Here in the Oh Dear Diner, which was formerly called Bright's Diner according to a sign outside, we walk into the shadowy rear hallway to receive a key which will take us deeper into the shadows of the story. Whether Alan might have avoided meeting the woman in black had he carried a light with him into the darkness is a question left unanswered by the game, but is one which has lingered with me since I first played Alan Wake. So far in the story, everyone has referred to Alan by his name, or obliquely as man or he or that damned yuppie. It's only on the way out of the diner carrying the key to the woman's cabin on Cauldron Lake that the Anderson brothers first call Alan by another name. It's easy to miss, especially if you're tuning out these two old men complaining about their hernias in a booth. But if we linger long enough to listen to their sleepy ramblings, the brothers each call Alan Tom before slipping into senseless mumbling. That's a name we've seen before. Tom the Poet was the name on the movie poster in the cabin from the dream. Here we have another small fracture in the veil between the waking world and Alan's nightmare. A fracture not brought about by Alan's own actions or the voice of the woman speaking from the dark, but by the presence of these two burnt-out old bards. There's no opportunity to interact with this comment, but both the misnaming of Alan and the presence of these two old men will prove important in later episodes. And one other name is important before we leave the diner. As we pass the old Anderson brothers, Rusty comments that they are harmless. But he is still going to stick around until their doctor shows up to return them to Cauldron Lake Lodge. Their doctor's name? Hartman. Even if we missed the name of Emil Hartman on the movie poster in the dream cabin, this is another beautiful moment of foreshadowing, giving us importance behind a name Alan will hear later this evening. And it does a lot of work to help us understand, if not empathize with, the strong reaction that he will have when he hears it. Only when Alan leaves the diner and climbs into the car with Alice and they drive away, only then do we finally get to see Carl Stuckey as he staggers out of the diner, waving a totally different set of keys and looking exceptionally unwell. Whatever took hold of him clearly had a lingering effect. And as viewers, we are now certain that there is something more, something strange, possibly even something supernatural, occurring even during the waking moments of Alan Wake. As with many of the other story moments in Alan Wake, the entirety of the scene in the Oh Dear Diner could have been replaced with a brief cutscene. But the designers clearly had an intention in compelling us to play through this passage. There are a couple of forced camera moves, some obvious dialogue triggers, and there's a moment of optional player interaction that I guess could seem a little awkward. But it all works together to give a strong impression of who Alan is as a character and what kind of story we are participating in as players. It's that element of participation, that intentional tension between the predetermined narrative, the predefined characterizations, and our own decisions or actions as a player, which stand at the heart of what makes Alan Wake haunt my thoughts. We may not understand everything which is happening, or even know whether we like Alan as a person. But there is a story here which is exploring some old questions about storytelling and fate in a way that few games dare, and in a way which only video games can.